So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending our first History Indoors talk on StreamYard. So, this live streaming platform on YouTube. It's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight. So, a few of you already in the live chat have been putting where you're watching from. So, please do add that to the live chat at the moment to tell us where you're watching from, which is brilliant. So, I'm Stephen. I have been a member of History Indoors since almost the very beginning. So it's just a very quick background on History Indoors. We're an organisation that's been given free history talks since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic during the first lockdown here in the United Kingdom. And our aim was that we're all university researchers, or most of us still are, but we wanted to give free, accessible public talks to you all. And we've been doing that ever since. We started off weekly and now we are fortnightly, but we have over 250 videos on YouTube. So please do head over to see the rest of our talks on YouTube. We have an Instagram page, a Twitter page, and a Facebook page as well. We usually have our talks on Zoom, but like I said, this is our first foray into live streaming onto YouTube. So it's great to see you in the chat box. So how our talk will work tonight, our two speakers who I will introduce in a moment will give their talk about the brief history of fairy tales, and then there will be a Q&A session at the end. So I'd ask you, it would be great if you could save your questions to put in the chat box at the end of the talk, just so that I can find them easily. And then I'll throw those up to the screen and throw them over to Joe and Caitlin to answer. So without further ado, our two speakers tonight, we have Joanna Strong and Caitlin Arak. Now, Joe is still just about a PhD student from the University of Winchester, studying about Mary I, isn't it, Joe?
Yeah, so Mary I and her legacy.
And then Caitlin Arak is a postdoctoral fellow at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. And your studies have been all about Canadian history, is that correct? Caitlin?
Yes. Yeah, I studied Canadian immigration in the post-war era at Queen's.
Fantastic. So as you probably have already gathered, this talk tonight, Not All Who Wander Are Lost, A Brief History of Fairy Tales, is going to be slightly different than their studies, but I'm really looking forward to this. So without further ado, I'm going to remove myself from the screen and I'm going to throw it over to Joe and Caitlin. Take it away.
All right. So I'm going to begin. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us here tonight. As was mentioned, this isn't exactly in Johanna or my wheelhouse, but we've had a great time putting together this talk and doing a little bit of research in something so different from what we study normally. Slide, please, Johanna. So in celebration of Halloween, we're discussing fairy tales tonight. I'm sure each of you can recall at least one fairy tale, perhaps Cinderella or Snow White, if you're a Disney fan, or Princess and the Frog, or even Baba Yaga. Perhaps some of you enjoy tales of fantasy. Amazon recently came out with the new fantasy show, The Rings of Power, slight nod to our title in his work. And this is a prequel of sorts to Lord of the Rings and loosely based on some of Tolkien's more obscure works in the realm of Middle-earth. But today we're going to be taking a very specific view of this genre, which is quite large. And we're going to be talking about Grimm's fairy tales and the history of what we consider folklore studies today. And then Johanna is going to discuss some of the most prevalent themes found in these tales and the significance of these themes. But before we begin, I have a question for you, the audience, though I'm going to let Johanna answer them here in person, but please put your answers in the chat. I am very curious. So Johanna, when you think of fairy tales, what's your favorite?
Oh my gosh. My favorite it's a hard one. I think probably Cinderella because it's memorable. I'm gonna go with that. We're gonna end the talk and I'm gonna think of something else. But that's the answer I'm going with right now.
And when you think of fairy tales, which fairy tale do you think is the oldest?
Oh my gosh. I am going to say that it is probably some variation of something's like Snow White-esque, something that involves a mother or a stepmother trying to off their child.
Fair. There are a lot of fairy tales like that. And then, final question, what is an essential characteristic of the fairy tale genre? What needs to be in there for it to be a fairy tale?
Oh my gosh. I think it has to have some element of like magic or mystery or something like unexplained, but you just have to roll with it or it's not going to make sense.
Great answers. And hopefully I can elucidate these answers a little bit more here as I go forward. So next slide, please, Johanna. So Marina Warner, who's an English historian and mythographer, begins her book Fairy Tale, A Very Short Introduction, which is phenomenal, with an analogy of a map. So this map in her work is a useful tool to consider fairy tales. Upon first glance at this map, and she visualizes it quite well. She doesn't have a picture of it, but she talks you through this map. And when you first look at it, you would see prominent landmarks. You would see Perrault's Histoire et Contes de temps passés, pardon my French, which is Tales of Olden Times, published in 1697. And then you'd see Grimm's Brothers, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, children's and household tales, published several different times across 1812 through 57. And though these collections dominate the map, they're the fairy tales we think of, they're the authors of fairy tales we think of when we first think of them. Upon closer inspection of the map, you see more and more stories from farther east, the Arabian Nights, for example, and more localized fairy tales, such as Hans Christian Andersen's stories from his Danish homeland, Walter Scott in Scotland, Alexander Afanasyev in Russia, and many other examples, giving us the stories of The Little Mermaid, Baba Yaga, etc. Warner's imaginative map is filled with little windows, each giving us a glimpse into the fairy tales told and retold across time and culture around the world. The fun part is getting lost in these tales, which people have done for generations. So next slide, please. Fairy tales and folklore are prevalent across cultures and throughout history. They date back thousands of years, with notable examples including Aesop's fables dating from the 6th century BC. But before I go further into the history of fairy tales, I do want to spend a minute on defining the genre, which is no easy feat. Fairy tales, myth, legend, and folklore are somewhat indistinguishable from one another in pre-literate societies, which has made it difficult in folklore studies to differentiate between the origins of modern tales. Fairy tale is a distinct genre within a larger category of folk tale, though the specific definition is the source of considerable dispute, and even Tolkien weighed in with a pretty poignant essay on his thoughts on the topic. Aspects of the characteristics and plot element overlap in tales of folktales, making it difficult to definitively define the genre, as they all do have similarities with one another. But in general, a folk tale is the overarching term which legends, myths, and fairy tales fall under. Sometimes folk tales are differentiated as stories passed through oral tradition, and fairy tales can be seen as written works of fiction, but this is not always the case. Legends are perceived as real within their culture, an unauthenticated history of sorts. They generally involve the belief in the truth of the events described, though there's a lot of fiction within these as well. A good example of this would be the legend of King Arthur and Camelot. So the legend or the myth of King Arthur, and there's a lot of debate about which it falls into, I would argue both, first appeared in Welsh poetry in the late 6th century as a hero who led the Britons in battle against Saxon invaders. The story evolved over time, reappearing across Great Britain, and eventually took on many elements of fairy tale as well. You'll think about the stories of magic and dragons and things like that you hear often today in stories of King Arthur. The story is suspected to be based on an actual leader from the 5th or 6th century, but there's no consensus or proper historical proof of the actual existence of King Arthur, especially as we know him from stories today, thus making him a legend. Myths are traditional stories that concern the early history of people or explain a natural or social phenomenon. For example, a classic Greek myth is the tale of Daedalus and Icarus. In this tale, the father builds wings for him and his son so they can escape captivity. But when flying away, Icarus flies higher and higher, eventually getting so close to the sun that the wax in the wings melt, and he falls to his death. So such stories have elements of warning in them. They have lessons to be learned, and provide kind of a sort of caution for the reader or listener. Fairy tales are different in that they do not actually reference actual people, places, or events, or religion, as some of the myths and legends have. And fairy tales are content in their realm of imagination. They exist solely there, even when they do incorporate themes and lessons for the audience to learn from. And most of them do develop as important lessons for the audience. Fairy tales, then, they incorporate fairies, magic, wizards, elves and trolls, gnomes and goblins, and sometimes the occasional dragon. Unless you're Tolkien, then they have to have dragons. Essentially, fairy tales are made up of magical and fantastical events and characteristics. Other folk tales, legends, and myths are not. They are sometimes more in the realm of believable. Fairy tales exist in the once upon a time rather than any actual time. They don't exist in a concrete form or medium. They are, according to Warner, as fluid as a conversation taking place over centuries, end quote. Today's works of fantasy would traditionally be classified as fairy tales, though the genres are now considered distinct forms of literature. So fairy tales were not originally conceived of as children's stories like we think of them today. Prior to the 19th and 20th century, adults were intended audiences, and in many cases, the stories were meant for all. And you can see that here. So we have the Old Mother Goose nursery rhyme up on your screen, and then the other is actually the Two Nanny Goats, which is in Azuela's tile art exhibit in Portugal that I got to see this summer. And this was actually, they were put on tiles for everyone in the city to see. So the stories are meant for all. In Madame d'Aulnoy's Parisian salon, the stories were very much intended for adults. They often contained explicit and violent elements that we would today consider unsuitable for children. Though she and others like her regarded the source material as the tales of lower classes and of children, they were very much adult stories. Even the original tales presented in Grimm's edited collections were not suitable for children. In the originals, there were many mentions of violence and explicit acts. They rewrote the stories after complaints to sanitize the tales. And in the Victorian era, classic tales were altered to incorporate the moralizing tendencies of the time period. Stories were altered to teach specific lessons, and violence and sexuality were taken out or at least minimalized in especially the modern renditions of these tales. For example, in 1854, Cruikshank rewrote a version of Cinderella to incorporate temperance themes, and more modern retellings of the classic fairy tales reevaluate the stories through lenses of feminism, multiculturalism, environmentalism, etc. And some of you, especially the Canadians, might know this one. Robert Munch's The Paper Bag Princess takes classic fairy tale elements and turns them on their head. So next slide, please, Johanna. So according to researchers, fairy tales date back thousands of years, as early as the Bronze Age. But this is hard to track, as only the literary forms have survived in many places. And as we will see, collectors of these stories, thank you, Grimm's brothers, edited their collections heavily to align with the times and cultural features in which they lived. So there are ample examples of fairy tales that are distinct among region and cultures. Some early examples of fairy tales include The Golden Ass, which dates back to 1 to 200 AD, the Bankatantra from India in the 3rd century BC, Arabian Nights, which was technically compiled around 1500 AD, but dates back far further. The 1500 AD is kind of European compilations of the stories. And of course, Aesop's, which date back from ancient Greece about the 6th century BC. The Grimm's brothers believed that European fairy tales derived from a cultural history shared by all Indo-European peoples and were therefore ancient, far older than any written records. Anthropologist Jamie Tarani supports this view with his research, and the folklorist Sarah Greca da Silva further supports it. So they used phylogenetic analysis, which is a technique developed by evolutionary biologists to trace the relatedness of living and fossil species, to pick up on specific elements and trace those back, noting the similarities in how they've shifted over time. And they actually analyzed the stories using this biology technique. And they looked at stories that included Jack and the Beanstalk, Beauty and the Beast, etc. And they trace the time of splitting of Eastern and Western Indo-European language groups in these stories to over 5,000 years ago. So both Beauty and the Beast and Rumpelstiltskin appear, according to this method, to have been created some 4,000 years ago. But they are not the oldest. The story of the Smith and the Devil, also known as Deal with the Devil in some versions, appears to date back to the Bronze Age, some 6,000 years ago. And various other studies converge to suggest that some fairy tales, for example, the Swan Maiden, go back to the Upper Paleolithic era. So that's quite a long time. I find it really interesting to think that these fairy tale stories that we know so well today, especially Beauty and the Beast, one of my all-time favorites, and it traces back to before English, French, Italian, before these languages existed. And it was told in an extinct Indo-European language long before the earliest literary records, and they were passed down from generation to generation, so we get to hear them today. I think that's pretty cool. All right, next slide, please. All right, so not so long ago, fairies, elves, witches, and jinn featured in belief systems of the past. In the pre-modern era, yes, but also far closer in time to now. In Scotland in particular, things like the fae folk and fairies were prevalent, especially in more rural locations and kind of the belief systems of these places. And these stories actually became present in the witch trials of the 15th and 16th centuries. James I of England, or James VI of Scotland, had a belief and fear of witches and demons that kind of causally extends into fairies. He's a character. And he was seen by some as quite superstitious. He believed that witches had caused the bad weather that had prevented his bride, Anne of Denmark, coming to Scotland, and other events as well. So he wrote the book Demonology, which was this kind of witch finding manifesto, and embarked on a lifelong crusade against witchcraft. Under him, an environment for witch trials and superstition, flourished. And when he became king of England, he changed England's laws so that there would be more severe penalties for witchcraft. So you can see here an image of him. In the two center tiles, you have one is a news from Scotland, and it's the North Berwick witches meet the devil in the local kirkyard. So James believed that these Scottish witches effectively prevented his bride from coming over, and they'd sent storms to plague her journey. And then on the far side, that top, the Riders, is actually the story of Tam Lin. So it's a British ballad that is one of the few mentions in which fairies and kind of hell are coincide. All right, next slide, please, Johanna. Yes, perfect. So in Italy, the poets and fairy tale collectors Giovanni Francesco Straparola, writer of Pleasant Nights, published in 1553, which was a collection of 75 short stories and fairy tales, and Giambattista Basile, remembered for his collection of Neapolitan fairy tales titled The Tale of Tales, or Entertainment for Little Ones, published in 1634, provided some of the early written forms of fairy tales. In France, Charles Perrault published stories or tales from past times, Histoire conte temps passé, as I mentioned already. And Johanna's smiling. I'm pretty sure I butchered that French, but that's okay. And so Perrault was a member of Académie Française, and his work derived from earlier folk tales, and they eventually go on to influence the later German versions published by the Brothers Grimm a century later. So this work reflected the popularity of fairy tales in the salons of Paris at the time, but across Europe more broadly during the Renaissance. The most notable of these salons in Paris, Madame d'Aulnoy's, collected, and she eventually went on to publish fairy tales, the Contes de Fées in 1697. And this term would give the name fairy tale to the genre of stories. And there are also elements of fairy tales present in other literature from the time. Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, Spenser's The Faerie Queene, and in many of Shakespeare's plays, we have evidence of fairy and magic. The late 17th and early 18th centuries marked the beginning of the modern fairy tale as we know it. Perrault and Galland are two of the first. They establish a fairy way of writing, as the folklorists of today call it. And later collectors and writers, starting with Perrault, but later taken up by the Grimm brothers, form a canon of fairy tales, and their printed versions establish the standard elements of the fairy tale genre. Rather a latecomer to the genre is Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and his stories of Middle-earth. He includes the quintessential elements of fairyland, incorporating elements from his own deep knowledge of Anglo-Saxon and Celtic myth and narrative, and of course includes a dragon, and it is him we owe our title to. So next slide, please. So the Grimm brothers were among the first to collect oral fairy and folk tales in a systematic way. They worked to preserve features of oral tales into written fairy tales, detailing linguistic, stylistic, and cultural distinctions. Though they considerably reworked the stories they collected for publication, and you can see this if you see different editions of their publication, that the stories do change. They are pivotal to the genre as we know it today, which is why the rest of my part of this talk, I'm going to focus on them. It is their history that I'll now turn. So next slide, please. So the Grimm brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm, are today regarded as the founders of folklore studies, as they established a methodology for collecting and recording folklore studies. Jacob, born January 4th, 1785, and Wilhelm, born February 24th, 1786, were the second and third eldest surviving children of Philip Wilhelm Grimm, a jurist, and Dorothea Grimm, daughter of a city councilman. So the brothers grew up in the town of Hanau, in the Landgraviate of Hesse Castle, and in 1791, the family moved to the countryside town of Steinau, which you can actually see their home here on your screen, where Philip worked as a magistrate. The family were financially comfortable, and the children were even educated by private tutors at home in Steinau. But in 1796, this all changed. When Jacob was 11 and Wilhelm 10, Philip passed away of pneumonia, and circumstances changed drastically for the family. Dorothea had to give up the large house they lived in and any servants that the family employed. Essentially, the family only survived on the financial support of Dorothea's father and her sister, who was a lady-in-waiting in the court of William II, Elector of Hesse. As the oldest living son, Jacob, at 11, assumed some of the adult responsibilities in the household, and he shared these with Wilhelm as time went on, and they tried to aid in the care for their family. In personality, the brothers were quite different. Jacob was introspective by nature, and Wilhelm was quite outgoing, though he often suffered from bouts of poor health as a child. In 1798, Jacob and Wilhelm were sent to Kassel to attend school, paid for by their aunt. They were seemed to be quite bright. Each graduated head of his class, Jacob in 1803 and Wilhelm in 1804. He graduated a year later than his brother because he'd missed a year due to scarlet fever, an illness that would eventually haunt him throughout his life. The brothers then attended the University of Marburg. They weren't originally accepted to the university, though. They weren't classified as high enough class and didn't have enough economic standing to actually be able to attend the university. But they appealed this disqualification, and with the aid of their aunt, were granted admission and had a special dispensation granted to them so that they could study law there. During their studies, the brothers were inspired by their law professor, Friedrich von Savigny, who shared his interest in history and philology with the brothers, and he introduced them to the German Romantics and the thinkers of the era. This friendship influenced the brothers to pursue studies in German literature, not law. And in 1805, Jacob actually accepted a research position in Paris to study German literature, and upon his return, he had to drop out of school to provide for his mother and siblings. In 1806, Jacob and Wilhelm began to collect folk tales as kind of a similar passion, but also a way to help support their family further. In 1808, when their mother died, first Jacob, and then shortly thereafter Wilhelm, became librarians in Kassel to provide for their younger siblings. By 1812, the Grimm brothers published their first volume of fairy tales, titled Children and Household Tales. This was a collection of 86 fairy tales, and in 1814, they would publish Volume 2, adding 70 stories to their previous collection. Eventually, 6 more editions were published, the final version containing over 200 number stories and 10 children's legends. They wrote several other collections of fairy and folk tales, and in 1819, the brothers received honorary degrees from the University of Marburg. There was a sort of disconnect between the intellectual elite and others engaging with fairy tales. And the Grimm's Brothers collection of stories reveals the desire for an authentic and original story, a cultural discovery, as it were, from the imagined true Germanic past peoples and culture. The irony of this is that when the Grimm's brothers were collecting these stories at a time, there was no unified Germany, though there was a political hope for one. And this political hope for one actually led the brother Jacob to giving up his position at a university because he refused to sign an oath of allegiance to the monarch in that region, thus forcing the brothers to return to Kassel. The Grimms were a part of a growing movement to retrieve and record the German spirit through myths, legends, history, customs. Though many of their early stories were too French or too sophisticated, so they pulled the stories apart. They chose details for their apparent Germanness and cut stories and details for failing a so-called nationality test. But do such tales reflect the cultural identity they're trying to discover? Or do such works shape that cultural identity for readers and audiences? This is one of the quintessential questions about diffusion of stories. The diffusionists believe that such stories traveled around the globe, changing as they go, and universalists who propose a collective unconsciousness, a repetition of a certain number of plots, and that all the stories are just variations of these plots. Next slide, please. The brothers, there we go. Wilhelm died in December 1859, working as a university professor up until his later years, and Jacob in September 1863 passed away. The brothers Grimm leave an important legacy, though, due to their work collecting folk tales and the field of folklore studies was born. Their various publications of fairy tales have also kept record of folklore from various cultures, including Germany, but also they have a collection of Irish folk stories randomly, and they prompted the collection of folklore elsewhere. Today, you can find books on folk and fairy tales from nearly any culture you can think of on the shelves at your local bookstore. The Grimm's brothers also worked to record German culture more broadly with their dictionary and also in recording of old German poetry and sagas. Today, their story has been reinvented in a series of popular adaptations and fairy tale-like stories. For example, the 2005 film The Brothers Grimm and the 1998 Ever After, and numerous TV shows and popular fictions. Disney also owes these brothers quite a debt, with many of their major motion pictures being based on stories recounted in Brother Grimm's fairy tales. For example, Snow White, Princess and the Frog, Rapunzel, the list goes on and on. The fairy tales we know today have a long history, and some have been around in one version or another as long as people have organized in cultural groups and told stories to one another. And now I'm going to let Johanna talk to us about some of the themes.
Wonderful. So we may have a slight hiccup here. Indeed, we will. So Stephen, I am going to, if we can take this PowerPoint off, I'm just going to share my slide share my screen if that works for you. Again, things that we're learning in this test drive. Perfect. Let us share. I don't need the audio. Okay. I am going to hope that this appears at some point. Yeah. Oh, isn't technology grand? So for as long as fairy tales have been around, so have the societal themes that they reflect. There are a few elements that we see in almost all fairy tales, though some to a greater extent than others. As Jane Kelly notes in her article about Rumpelstiltskin, fairy tales often provide guidelines for values, gender, and power, meaning that the stories they tell hold a deeper significance. It's for this reason that fairy tales have easily identifiable heroes and villains. So, Caitlin, I've also got a test for you. Hopefully mine are a little easier.
Yeah, mine were hard.
I'd also like to officially change my fairy tale to Beauty and the Beast because I forgot that that was a fairy tale, but Belle is just goals. So my test is, for each fairy tale I name, I'd like you to tell me the hero and the villain. So the first is Snow White and the Seven Dwarves.
All right, the hero is Snow White, obviously, and the villain is her evil stepmother.
Absolutely. what about Cinderella?
The hero is Cinderella, and the villain is her evil stepmother. Sensing a theme here.
Oh, I know. I'll try to shake it up for this one. So, what about Rumpelstiltskin?
Oh, the heroine is. I'm trying to remember what she started at. The miller's daughter? Wasn't she the miller's daughter? Okay.
Yep.
And the villain is Rumpelstiltskin.
Yes. So, as you can see from Caitlin's quicker answers than mine earlier, the heroes and the villains of each of these tales are really easy to identify. It's a little bit like Shakespeare. Chances are, if you're in the title, it's going to be about you, and you're probably the good guy. That's because it was so important that children immediately know whose behavior they should mimic and whose they should avoid. Beyond knowing who the heroes and villains of these fairy tales are, though, it was also important for children to learn specific behavior and attitudes, which is what we'll turn to now. As we do, I'd like to take a minute to say that I'm working from Margaret Hunt's Grimm's Household Tales, which is her translation of some of the Grimm brothers' work. These have been made available online by the Computer Science Department at Carnegie Mellon University, and I'd really encourage all of you to take a look at their fabulous collection. I should also mention that before talking about each of these tales, I'm going to give a summary of the fairy tale because, as I learned when I was reading the originals, some of these are very different from the Disney versions a lot of us grew up on. So while these tales can be used to teach children values and social norms, the Grimm brothers didn't necessarily write, as Caitlin was saying, with children in mind. Instead, they were tales meant to entertain the whole family, especially in an age when not everyone was literate. So now on to our fairy tales. As you may have guessed with my questions to Caitlin, I'm going to be focusing on the themes found in Rumpelstiltskin and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, looking especially at women's representation and depictions of the family. Sorry to anyone who got excited about Cinderella there. Maybe she'll feature in a future talk. So our first fairy tale is Rumpelstiltskin, a story about a woman, a bachelor king, and a creature named Rumpelstiltskin. One of the main characters is the miller's daughter, whose father goes to speak to the king. The father is concerned that the king won't think he's important, so he lies and says that his daughter can spin straw into gold. Because that's a totally normal thing to claim your child can do, I guess. Once the miller's daughter arrives at the palace to prove her skill to the king, she's told that if she isn't successful, she will die. No pressure. Of course, unsurprisingly, she cannot spin straw into gold, and so appears Rumpelstiltskin to help her. Eventually, the king, realizing he can make a fortune out of this, decides that if she can spin an entire room of straw into gold, then he'll marry her. Again, unsurprisingly, the miller's daughter still cannot spin straw into gold, and so Rumpelstiltskin again appears to help her. But this time, kind of ups his price. He says that he will only help her if she gives him her firstborn when she becomes queen. Assuming he'll never come back to claim the wager, the miller's daughter agrees. Unfortunately for the miller's daughter, now a queen, she does marry the king, she does have a child, and Rumpelstiltskin does remember their agreement. The miller's daughter, now the queen, is so upset when Rumpelstiltskin appears that she begins crying, and Rumpelstiltskin takes pity on her and her newborn child, saying that if she can guess his name, he won't take the child. As we all probably know, she does learn his name through a little bit of spying, and Rumpelstiltskin is so angry that she's able to find this out that he has the most massive temper tantrum and stomps his feet so hard that he gets stuck in the ground and rips himself in half. I guess that's a lesson for all the kids with temper tantrums, but not exactly what I remember from Disney. So to sum that up, the miller lies and puts his daughter's life on the line. The king is greedy and has some unrealistic expectations for what women can do, and the miller's daughter is just trying to literally not die, and then ends up being potentially forced to give up her firstborn child to a random creature that appears unbidden to help her. So, what does this say about women's representation? The best way to answer that is to look at the men's actions and the consequences that they're given. The father lies about his daughter's ability to get ahead, and he receives 0 consequences. Once he meets the king, he virtually disappears from this story. He's not the one who's potentially going to die because of the lie. His daughter is. The king is greedy and wants to gain his wealth by exploiting the labor of the miller's daughter. And yet, his greed isn't punished. Even though it's also his child who would be given to Rumpelstiltskin, the king doesn't appear in that part of the story. He sort of disappears once he marries the miller's daughter, and so his reaction to the consequences of his greed aren't included in the story. The miller's daughter, on the other hand, is the focus of the story and acts in a way that shows some pretty misogynistic interpretations of women. The miller's daughter could have told the king that her father was lying and so would have avoided potential death and the potential removal of her child. Instead, though, she sees that she can keep the lie going with Rumpelstiltskin's help. Her silence about her father's lie gets her ahead because it allows her to marry the king. What this shows to those who would be reading or listening to this tale is that the miller's daughter is willing to go against her morals in order to get ahead in life. A judgment which those readers and or listeners would have been able to see and would have condemned. Tied to this idea is this concept that the miller's daughter gets ahead by lying to the king and going back on her promise to Rumpelstiltskin. The way the Grimm brothers have written this tale, it seems as if the miller's daughter thinks lying and going back on promises is acceptable. What's quickly evident, though, is that she is punished for these immoral actions. Her lie, or her silence about someone else's lie, means that her life is at risk once she marries the king, and that her firstborn child could be given to Rumpelstiltskin. Whereas the immoral behavior of the other characters isn't pointed out or punished at all, the miller's daughter sees some major consequences. Even though her father's lie and the king's greed are as bad as her silence, it's only the miller's daughter who's punished. You could argue that Rumpelstiltskin is given a consequence for his actions, but he is, after all, the villain, and so we expect him to come to a nasty end. Somehow the men don't face consequences for their actions, but the woman, because she's caught up in the middle of the actions of others, does. By focusing on the consequences of the woman's actions, the Grimm brothers highlight the different standards for men and women, and so reflect their society's attitudes to the behavior of women, that they should be paragons of virtue or risk severe consequences. Our next fairy tale is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This is probably familiar to most of us, but it does have a very grim turn at the end, which I was not expecting. So Snow White is a beautiful child born to a king and a queen. Her mother dies when she is young, and her father remarries. The new queen is threatened by the beauty of her stepchild, so she, naturally, I guess, orders a huntsman to take Snow White into the woods and kill her. Once the huntsman and Snow White get into the woods, the huntsman takes pity on her and leaves her in the woods, assuming that she's going to die. Instead of dying, though, Snow White finds a cabin in the woods and makes herself at home. Little does she know that this cabin is the home of 7 dwarfs, who allow her to stay so long as she does the housework and makes herself useful around the house. The dwarfs know that Snow White is in danger, and they warn her not to open the door to anyone. As we know, though, Snow White doesn't listen and opens the door to a peddler woman who is actually the queen in disguise. We'll skip the details here, but the queen tries to kill Snow White twice before she comes up with the infamous apple plan. The queen poisons an apple that will kill Snow White when she eats it. Once again, the queen comes for a visit, and Snow White ignores the dwarf's recommendation, accepts the apple from the queen, and eats it. When she does, she dies. The dwarfs place Snow White in a glass coffin, but one day a prince comes to town and wants to take Snow White away with him because she is so beautiful. Can I just remind you here that she is dead, and he wants to take her with him. Along the road, a bump dislodges the piece of poisoned apple from Snow White's throat, and she comes back to life. When she does, the prince asks her to marry him, and she agrees. They invite the Wicked Queen to their wedding, where she comes to quite a disturbing end. Please be prepared here. She dies by being forced to wear hot iron slippers, and she then dances herself to death. That was the unexpected ending I was referencing when I said earlier that the original Grimm brothers stories do not end how I thought they did. There are quite a few layers here to analyze when we look at the depiction of women. The most obvious is perhaps the stepmother. Her envy is quite obvious throughout the story. It is, after all, this character who asks the famous question, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" and then gets upset when the mirror doesn't say that she is. As a villain, this envy is punished by her death at the end of the fairy tale. But isn't it interesting that the queen is condemned for her love of beauty, but the prince, who asks to take a literal corpse home with him because it's pretty, is taken as fine and acceptable? There's certainly a double standard happening here in terms of where envy and a focus on beauty is and isn't acceptable. Though she's the villain and so, of course, has to meet some kind of awful end, the queen faces a rather brutal death at the end of the fairy tale as a punishment for trying to destroy Snow White and her beauty, so that the queen can once again be the most beautiful. Nico Stringham, in the article Disney and the Butchering of Snow White, notes that the heating of the queen's shoes at the wedding and her dance to death is likely used as an allusion to her upcoming time in hell for trying to kill her stepdaughter. That's a pretty brutal ending for being jealous of someone else's beauty, even if the person who's jealous is the villain of the fairy tale. We also see some fairly misogynistic depictions of Snow White as well. The most apparent one is the fact that she seems a bit of an airhead. Snow White already knows that her stepmother doesn't like her and wants her dead, and so presumably would be aware that she should stay hidden while at the dwarf's house in case her stepmother found out that she was still alive. Nonetheless, she needs the dwarfs to remind her to not open the door to anyone. Not only do these dwarfs have to remind her in order to help her survive, she also blatantly disregards their advice and opens the door anyway, leading to, pardon the illusion, a series of unfortunate events. This representation negates any intelligence Snow White has and renders her an oblivious woman who has to be told what to do by the men around her. When she thinks for herself, in opening the door, she risks her life and again has to be saved by a man. The Grimm brothers also fall into the misogynistic trap about marriage and parenthood. The trope of the evil stepmother is one that we see in quite a few fairy tales, and Snow White is certainly one of those. The Wicked Queen is the opposite of what the Grimm brothers' society expected a woman to be. Instead of nurturing and a mother who cares for her children, she tries to kill Snow White. The Wicked Queen is a challenge to contemporary societal gendered norms and shows the perceived danger of a woman who isn't fulfilling what society expected of her. This queen, after all, defies societal expectations and then has to wear red-hot shoes and dance herself to death. There's not a lot of imagination needed there to see the link between behavior and consequence. The Grimm brothers also fall into the contemporary societal norm that women who remain unmarried are something abnormal. There's really no reason why Snow White has to be married at the end of the story. As Princess Elsa from Frozen would say, you can't marry a man you just met. The story is about defeating her stepmother, and even though the wedding serves as the moment to ultimately defeat the Wicked Queen, there's no need for this to happen at Snow White and the Prince's wedding. Written by the Grimm brothers during a time when unmarried women were often seen as disappointments to their families and as having failed gendered expectations to marry and have children, leaving Snow White unmarried would have felt somewhat impossible for the Grimm brothers. There are a few other moments I could talk about, but we want to make sure you have enough time for questions. But I'm more than happy to give my further thoughts during the Q&A if you'd like. We know this has been quite a whistle-stop tour of the history of the Grimm brothers and their household tales. But we hope that you've enjoyed this exploration into fairy tales as a genre, the Grimm brothers, and Rumpelstiltskin and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Caitlin and I have really enjoyed writing this talk, and it's given us a chance to further explore pieces of our own childhoods. So thank you all for tuning in today, and please do ask any questions you have in the chat box that is on your screen. So I will leave this up, and we will have Stephen, I think, come back to join us.
So thank you very much, Jo and Caitlin, for a fantastic talk. And I really like how it's really nice when we have talks where both of us are, but you know, you have two speakers. It's really nicely balanced between historical context and the history behind fairy tales, and then sort of going into depth into a couple of those fairy tales. So thank you very much, Jo and Caitlin. And just like Jo said, we're going to enter a time of question and answers now. So please do put your questions in the chat box, in the comments box for Jo and Caitlin to answer, and I'll throw those up on the screen one by one. And then also please just show your appreciation for the talk. So please do like and subscribe right now if you can, just to show your appreciation. Please put some lovely comments in the chat box for how much you enjoyed it as well. That would be wonderful. So just because we're on live streaming on YouTube doesn't mean that I lose my host prerogative of having that first question. So I will take the first question whilst people comment with theirs in the chat box. So I suppose a question to the both of you, and you may have sort of alluded to it in the talk, but maybe just a bit more specifically. My instant thought when you say fairy tales is Disney. That's you know, I suppose second is the Grimm brothers, but first is Disney. So what impact has Disney had on the longevity of fairy tales? And I suppose linked to that, if there was no Disney, if Disney hadn't, if Hollywood hadn't happened and there was no Disney corporation, would fairy tales have just sort of kind of declined, or what are your thoughts on that, either of you?
Would you like to go first, Caitlin?
I was going to say, you go ahead if you want to.
Okay, I am happy to. I think that Disney really makes these fairy tales like come alive in a sense. That it's kind of an easy activity and a fun activity to do with kids now, that kind of you can all get together and watch a Disney movie together. And it's something that kind of keeps kids entertained, but also if we go kind of strictly to the original fairy tale plots is a sort of here's acceptable and unacceptable behavior. So I think the idea that, these fairy tales lasted for thousands of years before Disney, I think they would probably continue to the same extent as they had historically. But I do think that Disney really adds that they become kind of the everyday quotable, I'm not sure if it's a word, but like memeable. They become part of the everyday culture. And obviously, I'm not living historically, and so I don't know, but I feel like Disney and Disney movies have maybe kind of grown in our culture to a greater extent than fairy tales have. Just thinking about the conversations kind of in my friend circles, if I admit, oh, well, I haven't seen this Disney movie, there's kind of that, "Oh, how have you never seen that?" But I think if I were to be asked the same question of like a written fairy tale, I think the answer would be the response would be very different. So I feel like fairy tales, to wrap that up, would still be here, and I think we'd still know them, but I don't think they would be as prolific in our culture and in kind of our childhoods.
What do
Yeah,
you
I
think,
think
Caitlin?
I mostly agree with what Johanna said, and I think she summarized, especially the meme culture of today has really kind of thrived. And the ways in which Disney has presented some of these fairy tales has made them thrive and made them universally popular, right? We're getting one narrative of these stories rather than the different renditions in different places. So I think in a way, Disney has allowed some of these stories to become more universal, right? Instead of having regional and cultural differences, you'll kind of just get that fairy tale from Disney. But that being said, I think when you look at kind of the history of folklore studies and fairy tales, the fact that these stories have existed basically, well, they've existed as long as people have gathered in groups, right? Like so I think in that sense, even if it weren't for Disney, these stories would very much be alive and present and continually told today. It's just today we have Disney that has taken up the mantle of these stories. So yeah.
Yeah.
Just forgot that I mute myself there. Thank you both for those wonderful answers. And just whilst you've been giving those answers, I've just thrown up a slide here that advertises our next couple of talks. I'll talk about those at the end, but there is a QR code for you to be able to visit our Eventbrite page and sign up for those. But I'll talk about more about that at the end. So I'll go to our first question in our comments box. We've also had a great comment from Susan, who's just said it's a great way to spend a dreary afternoon in Cincinnati, Ohio. So thank you for watching from the States. It's been quite dreary in the UK, a bit temperamental in the UK the last couple of days weather-wise as well. So we've got a question here. What do you think of feminist fairy tales and feminist retellings of the fairy tales? So this might play more into the second half of the talk, Joe, I presume, but I'll leave it to both of you to decide who will answer it.
I'm happy to start because I have a very embarrassing but cute story that goes with this. So I grew up in a family that very much was about feminist retellings, was very much you can't marry a man you just met before Frozen did it. And I remember that one of our assignments as a kid, I don't know if my parents remember this, so I'm probably going to get a lot of good lighthearted ribbing at Christmas for this. Our assignment was to retell a fairy tale. And me, being my precocious little 7-year-old self, did a feminist retelling of a fairy tale. And I don't even remember which fairy tale it was, but the heroine somehow saved herself on a Harley Davidson motorcycle, and the theme, like soundtrack to this entire thing, was "I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar." So that kind of is where this part of the talk comes from. And I think it's the same way that fairy tales kind of change across cultures, in that they all have kind of similar storylines, they'll have similar characters, but they'll be kind of specific to that culture. I think that feminist fairy tales and feminist retellings really are a significant intervention, I think is the best word to use there, in our cultural understanding of fairy tales. And so it's a way for us, kind of as 2022 people, to look and to go, well, we don't really agree with this. That's maybe not the message we want to be giving to kids. And so we change the way that fairy tales happen. And I think that's incredibly exciting. As someone who is in their late 20s, not married, is kind of doing a PhD, living their best life, I think it's incredible that, I think especially girls, but that boys and girls, and kind of neither boys nor girls, can have these figures to look up to, and to say that, not everybody has to be the Cinderella. You can also be the Belle who just wants to read books and have a library and be fantastic. And I think they're a really interesting reflection of how society is changing, and a really encouraging sign that society is changing. I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that, Caitlin.
Very well said, I must say. I do agree. I think for me, seeing, I guess, more and more feminist renditions of fairy tales is something that I find completely amazing. I grew up on, some of my favorite books were like Robin McKinley's Spindle's Edge. She's very much, she retells some of the fairy tales more for a kid's audience. But for her, the heroines in the stories, right? So Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, for example, one of her classics is Spindle's Edge, which is loosely based on Sleeping Beauty. And in these stories, she flips them on their head, right? That yes, these women are already technically heroes in these fairy tales, but what if we actually thought of them as heroes? What if the knight in shining armor didn't have to come rescue them? What if they rescued him, right? And I've always quite enjoyed those stories, and I do think the prevalence of them today speaks to kind of a fundamental shift in our society, where those kind of traditional gender norms in the early modern era have fundamentally shifted, right? In a way that I think is only advantageous. Yeah.
I've just got pictures. I can imagine there being a Disney hit fairy tale movie, Joanna, and there's a little girl on a Harley Davidson there. I think that would do really well these days.
I hope so. Someone does it.
So we've got a question here, and I think it might be more so for relating to Caitlin's part of the talk. So we've got a question here, and it begins. You mentioned two theories, I believe it's Caitlin who mentioned this, as to why fairy tales around the world have similarities. One, because they traveled around the world first before being put into written form. And the second idea is the idea of collective unconscious. Which one do you believe more, and why?
All right. Yes. I struggle with answering that one, in the sense that I do agree with some of it for both. I think the universalists have a point in that there are kind of a limited number of themes that get picked up, right? That's why we see so many of the similarities in these stories. But I don't think it's because the stories necessarily start all as like, the universalists believe in 7 fundamental plots, and that every story ever told is based off of those 7 plots. And the reason I don't want to fundamentally believe in it is because that seems slightly boring. You know what I mean? You're just adding more details, but essentially telling the same story. It seems somewhat limiting to me. So in that regard, I don't know how fully I believe in that. Obviously, these themes do become present over and over again in different cultures and different times. So there is that, but I do think there is spread to these stories, right? Like the reason Arabian Nights came to Europe and was compiled in 1500 by Europeans, some of the stories brought in with that were during the Crusades, right? People interact with one another and they share their tales, they share history, they share culture. These moments overlap, and then you have a broadening of some of these stories. And you do see very specific elements of tales depending regionally and where you go, right? Like Baba Yaga is one of my favorite fairy tale stories because the woman flies around in a mortar and pestle and her house exists on chicken legs. Like, you cannot make this up. And then my brain goes, of course it's Russian, right? Like, because there's just something quintessentially like, I don't know. And those kinds of stories, they share similarities with other places and other stories, but there's something quintessentially like a specific people group about some of these stories, right? In the way that when you hear some of the Celtic mythology, you kind of can pinpoint some of these moments as being quintessentially Celtic in nature. And then, of course, obviously sharing some elements with other cultures. But I think, yeah, I do think they spread around the world, and that kind of influences the similarities more so than the universalism. I don't want to fully discount the universalism because but I struggle with it.
It's like in biology, and I'm not going to use the terms because if my sister ever sees this, I'm gonna die. When you have like birds and bats aren't related, but they both have wings because they need to fly. And so like this idea that different fairy tales exist kind of and are similar because they have to do the same thing, but not because they necessarily started from the same spot.
Yeah.
If that makes sense in this tree.
Yeah.
You just mentioning that Russian fairy tale, Caitlin, reminded me something I wanted to pick up on the talk, and we're going to interject one of my own questions here, but then I will return to our viewers' questions. You mentioned something about a paper bag and a Canadian fairy tale. Would you be able to shed some light on that? Because as a Brit, yes. I have never heard of that.
Okay, so you have to Google Robert Munch's The Paper Bag Princess, and because of Joe's excitement, I'm going to turn over the quick telling of the story to her. It is just a classic.
So I forget all of the details, which is probably really bad, but what I do remember is that basically there's a princess and her castle burns? ? And she loses everything she has, and she somehow ends up with no possessions in the world, and all she has as clothes is this burned paper bag that she found. And so she wears it like over her head, arms through. It does not look very princessly at all. And is basically just like living the opposite of how you would expect a princess to look. And I forget what Ronald does, but Ronald comes and basically wants to marry her. And spoiler alert, she basically goes, Ronald, you are a bum and I will not marry you. And she basically is just like, no, I'm not dealing with this. You and your shenanigans can go elsewhere. And she basically just walks away and is like, no, I'm not dealing with this. Somehow in that, there is a dragon. I think he, at one point, does blow fire on Ronald because Ronald deserved it. But it is beautiful. Robert Munch is a glorious, glorious storyteller. And The Paper Bag Princess is just quintessential. It is what Tim Hortons is to food in Canada, is Robert Munch's Paper Bag Princess is for fairy tales.
Yes. Is Ronald a traditional Canadian name as well, or not?
Like, the only Ronald that I ever knew growing up was Ron Weasley. So I don't think so.
It was a lot more common, I think, back in like the early 1900s. But wasn't Ronald a prince, and she had to rescue the prince, right? And I think the dragon comes in that she has to rescue the prince from the dragon.
Yes.
And then he was like, "Oh, now I love you," because like she's in her paper bag as her dress because she doesn't have any possessions. So I assume the dragon burnt it down. And then steals the prince who she's supposed to marry, and he sees her and he's like, "I cannot marry you. Like, you're a peasant in a paper bag. Like, go away." And then she has to rescue him, and he's like, "Oh, I'm madly in love with you now." And she's like, "Yeah, sorry, don't care. Bye."
Yep. It's great.
And I love that even though it's Canadian, they're still pleasing Tolkien with the dragon.
They need a dragon. That is, I will agree with Tolkien on that. A dragon just... True. So often, though, the dragon is the villain. That makes me sad.
Yeah. And we've got another question from our audience. So there's a question here. How do modern musicals, for example, Wicked and Into the Woods, reclaim women's power? And I suppose from a British perspective, Wicked has been on in the West End for most of my life, I think. And I imagine it may be the same in other theatres across the world. So how do they reclaim women's power?
I guess I can start. I will admit that I know the plot line of Wicked, but have never seen it. And I know vaguely of Into the Woods, but again, have not seen it. But I think in terms of Wicked, I think it very much is this revisionist tale that it's basically what I do with my entire PhD, is to look at a figure and to go, maybe there's more to this story that we haven't looked at and that we should. And it provides these kind of, in a court case, it would be a mitigating factor. It kind of gives a reason for why she is the way she is and why the storyline that we see from the Wizard of Oz, like how that comes into being, that she wasn't always the horrible one. And I think that that's really changing how, I think, especially women in fairy tales and how women's stories in general are being told, that from someone else's perspective, it might look like A, but from her perspective, it looks like B. And so this reclaiming that she has a story and it is valid and it is valuable to be told, and that her ability to speak or sing, I guess, for herself is so life-changing kind of for us seeing it and just changes our perspective. And so I think it's a really nice step forward in reclaiming women's stories that have for thousands of years often been overlooked or have been maybe looked at, but not with in the good sense, the scrutiny and the value that they deserve.
Yes.
Have you got more to add, Caitlin?
Just really briefly, I would agree, especially with Wicked. Gregory Maguire's done that with not just the that story, but he's looked at other fairy tales and kind of repositioned them from kind of a different lens, right? So they're renegotiating whose perspective you're hearing from, which is, I think, a really interesting way in which history comes into this, right? Because there's this turn in historiographical studies, but also history more broadly, especially social history and this influence of social history to kind of expand on the subaltern voice, right? So expand on those voices who aren't generally present as active participants in the narrative, right? They are more passive characters. So in Wicked, when you watch The Wizard of Oz, there we go, that's the name of it. When you read that book or when you watch the movie, the Wicked Witch is just a passive character, right? She does these very specific things. You don't know anything more about her except she wants those shoes. Well, what's actually going on in her life? What are those things? And that's some of the things that Wicked brings out so beautifully. and Into the Woods as well, right? Looking at those different fairy tales, but through a bit of a different lens. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting way in which social history is kind of interjecting with kind of this folktale studies and literary studies.
And that leads us nicely on to my last question. So it doesn't have to be the last one. Please do feel free to add any more questions into the comments box whilst I'm giving this question and whilst Joe and Caitlin answer it. But I suppose that neatly segues onto what I wanted to ask you was, what do you think the future of fairy tales are? Do you think that it may be traditional fairy tales, but portrayed in a revisionist way, like with Wicked, for example, a twist on the traditional fairy tale, looking at it from a different narrative, a different perspective? Or do you reckon that Disney and other companies are going to lead the way in creating new fairy tales based upon more contemporary values? What are your thoughts on that?
I was going to say, I don't have a whole lot of hope that Disney is going to kind of lead the way with contemporary values, just because they are still very traditionalist in so much of their storytelling. I'm even thinking of and there's so many things that they still have to figure out in their storytelling to properly tell some of the narratives with today's values embedded in them. But I do think we are definitely on a turn where works of fantasy and fairy tale are very much popular in their popular works of fiction, right? You go into any bookstore, and like I did this the other day, I was in Indigo and I just looked at like the youth fiction, and it's so many different kinds of fairy tales or fairy tales retold, or like fantasy stories that have these elements of fairy tale in them. And they're popular for a reason, right? They've lasted this long because they are popular. They tell a good story, but they also talk about values and cultural norms and things like that in a really powerful way. And even if we see, like, look at what's on Amazon Prime right now. What are the new shows coming out? So many of them focus on kind of these different elements of fairy tale, or embed some of these elements of fairy tale in them. And I think they are something that is timeless in a sense, that fairy tales are not going away by any stretch of the imagination, though it is really heartening to see all of the modern renditions of them, right? Whether that's including multiculturalism, talking about racism in these fairy tales, feminism, these sorts of things. Like these values we have today are starting to be told through these lens of fairy tales, which is, I think, another way to even expand on those messages for children, which is something that has happened for centuries in these stories. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know what triggered it, Caitlin, but I was thinking Gail Carson Levine wrote, it was a 2-volume set of kids' books, and it was The Princess Tales, and it basically put like women at the center of the story, but kind of took all sorts of fairy tales that we would all recognize and like scrunched them all together, so that in one story you might get Rapunzel and Jack and the Beanstalk and something else, and they would all come together and create this new story, but you kind of knew where it was going because you knew the originals.
Yeah.
And I feel like, as you say, like that's very much, I think, where we're going, that maybe we don't necessarily focus on new stories. I think maybe it's putting those spins on the stories that we already know or that we think we know. With that being said, I think hopefully, if anyone has any sway with Disney out there, I think it'd be great to see them kind of move this forward and to say, like, let's update some of these fairy tales, or let's take fairy tales from cultures that kind of we as white Western European and centuries ago European kind of would understand and recognize, and maybe introduce a new audience to these tales. So I guess hopefully that will happen. But we'll see. I think a great first step would be to see more things like Wicked, to see more things that are kind of retelling the stories we know from different perspectives.
And there does seem to be, sorry, this brought up a thought bubble in my brain. And there are some really interesting, like Disney has done some work incorporating other stories into their canon, right? Like if you think about Moana,
Mhm.
that's using very much a Polynesian, I believe, kind of logic to it, which is really interesting. They tried it with Frozen 2,
Oh.
hit or miss, but incorporating other voices, right? Not just the kind of Anglo Western narrative and fairy tales, kind of expanding their kind of genre to incorporate the other cultures, and especially incorporating those other cultures, which with actual proper representation from those cultures, right? Not just Disney being like, we like this story, copy paste. Actually, letting those people tell their story is, I think, really, really important. And there was another book that popped into my brain is Jane Yolen's. I cannot remember the title of it, but she wrote a kind of fairy tale loosely based on Sleeping Beauty, but she did it through the historical story embedded within that fairy tale that she used was actually a telling of the Holocaust. So, like, being able to use some of these fairy tales to talk about difficult moments in history is also, I think, something that is starting to happen that can actually, I think, in many ways be really helpful to introduce younger audiences to these difficult histories, right? Like when you talk about the Holocaust, I've taught it to university students, and I have no idea how educators of junior high, high school, primary school talk about these histories. Like it's a hard topic to talk about. So something like a fairy tale might be a way to kind of start those conversations. So blending those elements can, I think, be useful in other senses as well, and learning about other cultures and other historical moments.
The great thing about the internet is that our talk is going to be accessible on YouTube for an indefinite period of time. So if anybody from Disney is watching this back, even in a couple of years' time, and you're watching this back now, hopefully you're getting a few ideas from Joe and Caitlin's talk. And that theme of the internet, we did have one more question come in, so I'll make this our last question, and it is the theme of the internet. So the question is, how do you think internet meme culture affects how we as a culture interact with fairy tales? And from memory, I think there was a comment about a meme during the talk. So yeah, how does internet meme culture affect how we as a culture interact with fairy tales? Interesting question.
I feel like, okay, this is gonna age me, but also, um, which I've missed this year and needs to be fixed as soon as possible. Um, I grew up watching like Rocky Horror, watching Young Frankenstein, like watching these kind of cult classics. And there would be lines that you'd quote, but I hadn't seen Young Frankenstein yet, so it was funny, but I didn't know why, but it was funny. And I feel like that's what memes do now is when it rains and I make the joke of like, "Oh, my perfect wickedness, I'm melting." And my friends who haven't seen The Wizard of Oz are just like, "What is wrong with you?" But I think it's hilarious. And I think, like, memes make it so that everyone would laugh at that, not just the people who have seen The Wizard of Oz and know why it's funny. I think, like, this meme culture makes it that even if you don't know the kind of original context, you've seen, like, the TikTok video where someone, like, puts it up and then applies it to their own life, or you've seen it when someone just goes like, "This is the mood today." Um, I think one of the teachers that I work with just puts and Caitlin will know this scene better than I do, in explaining world history, puts up John Smith from Pocahontas, just puts the scene where it goes, what's the line? Basically, like, white men cause all the problems, and just, like, puts that up there and is like, "This is history for you." And I feel like it just memes just make it so much more relatable in a way that you don't have to have experienced the context in order to understand the meme. It kind of makes it its own subculture. And I think it means that we interact way more with fairy tales, but probably less explicitly with the fairy tales, if that makes sense.
And I think with memes too, the nice thing about them is because you're only getting that snapshot, so often those little snapshots are actually critiquing those kind of fundamental issues we have with fairy tales, allowing us to think more critically about things like feminism in them, right? So that meme Johanna's referencing, the movie has a whole song about it, right? Like that whole Colors of the Wind song is about like, hey, like John Smith, you silly little white dude, like, do you think about anyone beyond yourself? Like, come on.
No.
She's got a whole song to it, plus several other references in the movie in like this great way. But when you just see a meme of it, you get this one line and you're instantly hit, right? Because memes are great at picking the most opportune images, like the meme Johanna shared earlier, when you have Elsa going, "You cannot marry a man you just met," and all of the other Disney princesses are just in tears because some prince broke their heart for 30 seconds in the movie, right? So it's really, really interesting to see that memes so quickly pick up not just the funny moments, but also these super applicable moments where you're like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, I should be critiquing that. Maybe that is something I need to give further thought to. That if you read the whole fairy tale or watch that whole hour-and-a-half movie, you're not necessarily going to think of in the same with the same poignancy as you would like a 3-second meme. So yeah, I quite
It's that
appreciate
whole,
the meme culture.
yeah, I think it's that whole, I guess this is not necessarily a meme, but it's like the musical content of Disney. I haven't seen, I think it's Encanto. I just have not had time. And was talking to a friend and just went, I'm sorry, why don't we talk about Bruno? And like that's all I wanted to know. I didn't want to know the plot, but I feel like that's the perfect meme moment of like, I understand that we don't talk about Bruno, but why? Like these are the questions I need answers to. And I feel like that's the perfect kind of meme answer moment where instead of going, just watch the movie, the meme would go, well, this is why.
I think you have a list of like movies to catch up on over
Yeah,
the winter
do.
holiday, Johanna.
And if anybody would like to add to Joe's list, please do comment in the chat box. Or if you're watching this in the future, please put it in the comment box and Joe can always come back and add to her list. It just made me laugh
I'll
as
watch
well.
them.
It really resonated with me, your point, Joe, about, you may not have even watched the film, but the meme is funny. Michael, our founder, he's also been moderating the chat as well, and he whilst we were getting prepared for the talk, he just sent me the Sesame Street meme because we were both on the same StreamYard account, being able to moderate at the same time. It was a bit odd, and he just sent me the a meme of the red Sesame Street character, I don't even know his name, with a flame behind it,
No.
and I found it hilarious, even though I've never watched Sesame Street. So okay, well, it's been an absolutely wonderful evening. Thank you very much to, well, first of all, Joe and Caitlin for a fantastic talk. Thank you for all our viewers as well. And for those who have interacted in the chat box, please do take this last moment to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and to just put your comments of thanks to Caitlin and Joe in that chat box before we end the broadcast. Just on your screen, you'll be able to see the two next talks that History Indoors are providing. So in 2 weeks' time, it is my talk on who was Margaret of Wessex or St. Margaret of Scotland. That's also going to be streamed, live streamed on YouTube. So please do scan that QR code, and then you can find details of how to sign up for free. And you'll be sent the YouTube link ahead of the talk. And that will link also to some of that to James I. So James I made an appearance in this talk, which I got a little bit excited about, and James I will feature in this talk as well in 2 weeks' time. And then after that, in middle of December, we've got a talk by Mike O'Keefe, the second in his series of code breaking and warfare, and this time it is about Enigma. So again, please scan that QR code, or you can see at the bottom of our screen, visit www.historyindoors.co.uk for information of how to sign up for free. Also, I'll just put up some of those messages of thanks on the screen. Thank you for that. And I would also encourage you, please, not only subscribing to our YouTube channel, please do follow us on Instagram and on Twitter and on Facebook, where you'll find some more information about our forthcoming talks. But aside from that, thank you all for watching. Thank you, Joe and Caitlin, and we shall see you all in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye, everybody.